Before I begin, I wish to acknowledge the original custodians in which I meet with my virtual panel today, and I'd like to pay my respects to those elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Sasha Purcell. I'm a Torres Strait Islander human rights lawyer, United Nations delegate, and a Fulbright PhD doctoral researcher in the areas of human rights, international law, and climate change. Climate change is a scourge on the planet as the Earth's temperature and sea levels rise. The impact of climate change is acutely felt by Indigenous people, a people who contribute the least to the causes of climate change, yet are the greatest impacted. Legal avenues are now developing in the space in respect to protecting the rights of land and sea and nature. The idea of rights of nature is providing a new and unique avenue for redress. Rights of nature is a new legal concept and an instrument that allows nature, in its whole or part, to have inherent rights and to be legally protected in the same way that people and companies are. Ecosystems and species have legal rights to exist, to prosper and regenerate. It allows the environment to be defended in court, not only for the benefit of humans, but also for the sake of nature. The jurisprudence for this law is growing. For example, the Whanganui River in New Zealand is now considered a person under domestic law, while the Ganges River in India was recently awarded human rights. The right to integral respect of nature is now included in Ecuador's constitution. What exactly does all of this imply for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities advocating for this recognition of rights of nature and Indigenous scientific knowledge? In today's discussion, I am joined by three impressive Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and Pacific Islander panelists. Our first guest is an active community leader, human rights and earth rights advocate, filmmaker, and a respected academic with 2 PhDs amongst a raft of other degrees. Welcome, Anne Polina. Next is Francis Nona, a proud Torres Strait Islander man from Bardu Island, and he's a registered nurse. Francis has a postgraduate degree in public health and a passion for Indigenous health. Our final panelist is an expert in Indigenous rights and international environmental law, as an experienced litigator who is currently special counsel with the Environmental Defender's Office. Welcome, Fleur Ramsey. And there's so much more that I could say about these incredible panelists, as they have so much expertise amongst them. But Fleur, I wanted to start with you. Fleur, can you tell us more about the rights of nature and why it is important in the next step for protecting Indigenous land and seas?
Thank you for that question, Sasha. I just first wanted to acknowledge that I'm on Biripi people's land in Port Macquarie, and I recognise that sovereignty was never ceded here or in anywhere else in Australia. Well, let's start with, I'm going to try and start with a definition of rights of nature, but I want to say that that's particularly difficult because one of the problems with it is that it's been used as an umbrella term, and it captures a lot of different movements under it. And so if I start with that premise, and then I'll discuss that a little bit more. Because it's an umbrella term, I think I would say that there's a Western influence stream and then there's an Indigenous-led stream, and they're not necessarily the same, and that needs to be understood. So I'm going to start with the Western definition, and then I'm going to provide a definition that I think might be better suited to understanding what it could be, particularly in relation to the way that Indigenous people are thinking about it. So in the Western definition, it's an ecosystem or a natural community that is not mere property that can be owned, but are entities that are independent and have an inalienable right to exist and flourish. And the particular Western focus there is assuming that that these ecosystems are already property that's already within the Western framework. So the way that I like to think about it is to say it's an ecosystem or natural communities which should be protected and respected as beings rather than things, with integral relationships that make it what it is, and which are fundamental to its health, longevity, and life. And so that's more a relational way of thinking about what it is, and not only relational from a perspective, I think, from an Indigenous perspective, that will have a relationship with that particular ecosystem, but also thinking about its own integral relationships with other species and other aspects of the environment. And so a very good example of that, I think, is the example that you started with, Sasha, which is the Whanganui River example, where the river is defined in a much broader sense, as from the mountains to the sea. It includes all the tributaries, and it's also defined as its metaphysical and its physical properties, which is a much broader definition there. The potential, I think what's useful for it and why I remain committed to thinking about it, is that I think it's a absolutely important communicative device, and it forces people to shift their imagination, particularly people who don't think or haven't really been in the practice of having a relationship with a particular place or with nature. And so I think it's really useful in that way. I think for Indigenous people, particularly in places like Aotearoa, and the Whanganui River is a good example, it's a way of trying to regain some control over something that's important to them. And often that's been compromised. So they may not get their sovereignty back in relation to that particular place, but they do get it thought about in a way that they may think about it, and then avenues for control, such as guardianship. So I think that's been the particularly useful element for Indigenous peoples. There are some limitations to it, and I know Anne's going to talk about one aspect of those limitations. I'm just going to mention two. The first is there's a real danger, particularly for Indigenous people, that it's going to be used as an imperial concept, so an imperial concept of nature. And so, you know, English is very good at saying this is the environment, when Indigenous people say, no, well, that's something completely different to us. And it's the same thing, I think, with the rights of nature. So we have to be very critical of how it's used and not allow it to be used in the same way that the conservation movement ended up actually disrupting Indigenous relationships and connections to place. So that's one really important thing. And then the other important thing is it's really, to say that something has inherent rights, it has to be given rights. So if you actually look at a lot of the examples, because they're compromises, for example, in New Zealand, the river hasn't been given rights. It doesn't have a right to flow. It doesn't have a right to exist. What it's been given is a very limited idea of what personhood is. And so what natural persons and corporate persons, as you talked about, and really all we have as rights as persons are the right to sue and be sued, which is very important, obviously, for the fact that that element of nature can go to court, the right to enter contracts and the right to own property. And so it's the same dilemma for humans. You have to be granted rights to have rights, and it's not necessarily inherent of the legal concept of personhood.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the interesting things in relation to this, is that it's such a new concept, but the westernized version of the rights of nature doesn't touch on, I guess, the idea that it's a living entity and that it's connected to us in a spiritual way. In relation to just what Flo was talking about, personhood, and I'd love to ask you more about what you're working in that space in relation to personhood and the Matawa River, for example.
Yeah, thank you. Mabubara, ngajunu nilawala and Polina, ngayu imadawara man, and ngai manda jaranyigana, ngai nganga on Jugun and Yaru country. Look, thank you. I was just saying good day. I'm in Broome, which is Jugun and Yaru country, but in my introduction, I said ngayu imadawara man, which means I am a woman who belongs to the Fitzroy River, the Matawa. So with that identity comes an obligation to make sure my guardianship and stewardship for that living water system is just recognized now, but projected into the future. So, as I said, I am a woman who belongs to the Fitzroy River. So this is a very interesting concept because we looked at the Whanganui River when it came up, and Māori people are doing amazing things around this. But I think we just want to take a step back because I think one of the big challenges across the globe is how do we create peace with nature and with Indigenous people? And as Indigenous people, we have not walked away from nature. We are part of nature. When we are born, we are given a totem or a judinj to teach us as a human being how an animal can teach us to be fully human. And we are bonded in a lifelong relationship to that creature. So the Matawa, when I came back and I said, oh, you know, Māori people are doing this and they've gone ahead and they've called it Personhood. And I came back and I sat on the river with the elders and I talked about this and they said, "You're not a human being. The river is not a human being." And so this put me into in a way, a challenge of, well, how do we look at bringing this in to modernity in terms of shaping this? So a lot of the work that I've been doing is around ancestral personhood. It is about relationship. We see the river is a living being. We sing with it, we cry with it, we dance with it, we celebrate with it, we communicate. And what is very, very interesting is that other people, non-Indigenous people, can come into our world and say things like, "Hey, I heard the river waking up." So we can teach people how to feel country, how to be in country, how to feel and see this. So this is all of the concepts that we're saying is that I come in, obviously as a scientist, but from a first law perspective, law of the land, not law of man. What has nature taught us in regards to our custodialship, our stewardship for caring for country, whether it's in the sea, the desert, the ranges, or anywhere else? So it's all about relationship. It's acknowledging that everything has a right to life. The conversations that we hear about rivers having rights, and is exactly what Fleur is saying, is that we believe the river is a living system. It has a right to live, but more importantly, it has a right to flow, because the river for us, the Matawa, is a life force. It's the construction of our identity. It's not just about sustainable development, but about sustainable lifeways. We have first law stories that are stories from the land that are taught to us from a non-human creature. How a serpent can teach us values, ethics, code of conduct. As Indigenous people, we are the oldest scientists in the world. We come from multidisciplinary science background. This is the first law. This is the law of the land. This is embedded in our cultural practices. We are trying to embed this ethics of care, this custodialship to fellow Australians, to get them to see and feel the country a different way. So in it, it's not just about how do we deconstruct law, but it's also a question of why do we have law? Why do we have law? And in my nation and in the Kimberleys, we come from that background where we use the first law stories to teach us values, to teach us ethics, to teach us how to self-regulate in an environment that has become so chaotic. So it's looking at, as not only are we, when we're born, given a totem, but we are taught as Aboriginal and Islander people to be observational. When we are young, the elders teach us, look up in the sky, look down in the ground, be peripheral with our vision, look beyond just the me to the we. And I think this is really, really important, because when we talk about law, where I come from, we talked about these values, these ethics, these code of conduct. How do we create and maintain civil society where everything is valued, where everything is loved, where everything is cared about? So it's really a philosophical position, first law, of how do we bring that into the framing? Because what my work has shown me is that globally, it has been Indigenous leaders who have led the rights of nature conversation, because these big projects are impacting where we live, what we love, what we care about. So globally, it has been Indigenous people who have led the rights of nature and has been tagged in a way with conservation, restoration of the ecological system. So what we're trying to do collectively, all of us, is get people to see the world a different way. When I look at the laws in Australia, particularly around the environment, they are no longer fit for purpose. I live in Western Australia and we are creating laws, state-sanctioned violence to destroy our sacred sites. Now, what we're saying is that, you know, when we saw the destruction of Juukan, what the world realized is that this is the first form of human thought coming from our nation, coming from the oldest, you know, and the wisest cultures in the world. And yet we are struggling with, how does law fit into public policy? How does law fit into law reform? When really what we have is a clash of values. We have a clash of values in terms of what we care about and how that's conflicted with unjust, invasive colonial development that is going on and on. So there is, and I just want to put a rider on, it's an emergence of a conversation around ancestral personhood. It has a long way to go, but you know, many people say to me, if you want to be a brave, you have to be brave. So we have to push the boundaries. We have to bring in new ways of thinking, because if we are to live in peace and harmony with each other and with nature, we really need to start to see and be in the world a different way. And we have to understand what is the cost of the laws and the public policy that we have in the preservation of our knowledge, in the preservation of our wisdom, in the preservation of our culture, because we need collective wisdom. All of us sitting here come from extremely different backgrounds, but we come here today to share how this collective wisdom must come together, because we are dealing with complexity, whether it's science, whether it's law, and any of these frames. So from that perspective, what I'm saying is that Indigenous people are not challenging the system, but bringing our own systems thinking in and saying that if we want to live in peace and harmony with nature and with Indigenous people, we have to see and be in the world a different way. And if it's through law, well, you know, great. But the question for me right now in our nation is, why have these laws?
Yes.
You know, when they're not fit for purpose, why have them? How do we challenge them? How do we deconstruct them and find new ways to create civil society where culture can be valued, the oldest cultures in the world can be valued and looked at? How do we shape the world going forward? How do we dream a new dream? Thank you.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the biggest issues, is that Indigenous people have a relationship with nature, and we have that first law, but it is not recognized in the current legislation or in the laws that come out and in the jurisprudence. So I guess we really have to, make our own way, make our own path to figure out how we can protect the significant nature of where we live and our ancestral connection to that. You mentioned in relation to there being, a discrepancy with Western knowledge recognizing Indigenous scientific knowledge. Francis, I wanted just to ask you how you found that and what challenges you faced in your research and in your career in relation to that being an actual problem where its question is undermined, it's not respected, when it has led us to survive for thousands of years.
This is one of the biggest challenges, thank you. With my work in bringing Indigenous knowledges to the forefront, when we think of knowledge systems, we've operated of millennia within Indigenous elders teaching our young on how we do things. But in the tertiary education and in universities, there's a superior knowledge that suppresses Indigenous knowledge. And we've got to bring this to the forefront, that what does it make Western ways of being and doing more superior than Indigenous knowledges when we've been so connected to country for so long? And when I think of Indigenous knowledge systems, I think of the understanding of Indigenous knowledges as not a simple or homogenous area, and oversimplifying so many diverse knowledges is disempowering and colonizing. There are many different Indigenous knowledges that are related to place on both a global and Australian scale, and some are specific to place and people. While there are also Indigenous knowledge epistemologies that are similar across Indigenous people across the world, there are differences in the Indigenous epistemology, ontology, and exology that contrast with the mainstream Western ways. The ways of knowing are specific to place, and we learn from this from an early childhood through the elders. Indeed, children get to know intimately the seasons, animals, and landforms for people who live on that place, or in our terms, country. The Indigenous ways of our people who live on this place, together with relationships and connections between animal seasons and landforms and entities, including us as First Nations people, the ways of doing are also taught from a young age and include artwork, dance, ceremony, and language that is special to our region and articulate how we interact, our cultural responsibilities, and our interact with the ways of knowing and the ways of being. And I think of Western society constantly not aligning with these knowledge systems, constantly suppressing them and challenging them as if it has no power or no stance. And we constantly are trying to being asked to show evidence, how does this work? And I grew up on country in Torres Straits, and the ways of being and the way they looked after country go back generations and generations. And what we foresee is what's happening has been noted, and Western ways of being is like constantly playing catch up. It's like, why is this happening? Why is this taking place? And this is the emergence of two knowledge systems come together, but one being suppressed. And I think for First Nations people, our voice has got to be up in the forefront.
Absolutely. Flo, what do you think we can do in relation to kind of pushing this agenda? Because we have the Australian government in relation to the Torres Strait 8 lawsuit who are saying climate change is a future concern. Obviously, all of us know that that's not true. It's a current concern, it's a past concern. Since the 1970s, my research has shown that Australia, the government has been warned about what's happening now. So what do you think we should be doing in relation to kind of pushing that envelope and being, I guess, a disruptor in the space to try and get those human rights that we deserve?
That's a good question. So I think there's a number of different ways that I might think about how we can do that. And I think one of the great things, and going back and talking about the two different sciences and how one is suppressed, is that I've started talking about through looking actually through Samoan cosmologies and Samoan creation stories. And I now say that they speak a truth. As Anne was saying, it's the source of law, it speaks a law. And I think a really good example where people might have started to understand that was through the kind of advocacy that was done during Standing Rock by the Standing Rock Sioux and using the term water is life. And so for me, and I know another scholar, Nick Estes, says the same thing. He goes, well, that's a universal truth. And that's something that actually people started to recognise. So now I really throw it back and say, well, actually, this is Earth law. This is actually, water is life is fact. It's scientific fact. So I think it's being really kind of creative and using our stories to make those translations for people and making good translations. I think one of the great things about Pacific Islanders in being the leaders in the climate space is that the way that they talk about climate change is quite poetic, that I think that they've actually captured the imagination of people. And so I think using our stories as part of our advocacy, including in law, is really important and a way to do it. And then on the front of the human rights front that you were talking about, well, you know, I have to confess I was a little bit skeptical of human rights. But when I really started to delve into how Indigenous people are using human rights and transforming that space, I actually became really hopeful. And so, you know, the right to culture, for example, was used so creatively by Indigenous people to actually put a limitation on development, so that when something's significant, the state can't actually, at least under international law, isn't allowed to destroy culture. And I think that's a really remarkable thing. And the other thing that human rights lawyers are doing, which is trying to address the structural problems. So the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, for example, has started to go after the doctrine of discovery. And that was through a submission by the Apache Ni, who went after the Holy See. And so the CERD required the Holy See to negotiate around potentially repealing a papal, I forgot what they call a papal bull from the 1500s, which permitted the destruction of the Americas, and by which Captain Cook came through the Pacific. And so I'm kind of, I'm always in awe of the ingenuity of what Indigenous people are doing, and that's the force that I'm moving through, and that's what I think we need to do. Bring out what we do well, and then take it to the world. Yeah.
So in relation to, I guess, that ingenuity, I wanted to turn back to Anne. So you're the current chair of the Matawa Fitzroy River Council. Can you talk about what outcomes you've achieved, and just, I guess, give us some insight into your unique position as a person that is connected to this location, but also are respected in the field and is able to, I guess, speak in these areas and make changes that set precedents for future Indigenous people to try and gain recognition for their rivers and oceans and trees and forests. So I'd love to hear more about just how you were able to kind of push that agenda and, you know, question the ideologies that Western institutions consider not to be applicable to Indigenous populations.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. This is a very, very interesting story, because this is the first time in 40 years that Indigenous people and nations have come together to stand in solidarity for the river. As I said, it actually means river of life, Matawa, river of life. So it's a life force, it's an energy system. So Aboriginal leaders have come together. Now, part of really decoupling these systems of colonialism is, in a way, to decouple our own minds as Indigenous leaders, because we've been forced through the colonial process to be in conflictual situations. There is a lot of work we need to do as Indigenous people and Indigenous leaders in terms of healing within our own systems, healing and moving back from conflict to cooperation. So it's been a huge amount of investment where the leaders have stood and said, look, we have to do this, we have to do it now. And don't worry, it's not an easy job, because there are other Indigenous neoliberal leaders who are coming to us and saying, we didn't think you're going to generate this amount of evidence. How can you do this? Because once we started to become, public, then we had to get the story out. And I know that when we published an article in the paper which said Matawa Fitzroy River too precious to pump, within 12 hours, I had a phone call from one of the ministers, and we had our funding cut. So once you start to have a voice and you challenge these seats of power within our own Indigenous leadership, but broader into the wider community, it's going to be a bumpy ride. So one of the things, as I said, as a scientist, we have, I believe that evidence is so important. But not only am I sitting here as a scientist, I'm sitting here as a filmmaker, as a poet, as a storyteller. And what I'm seeing is that, in a way, science is so important, triangulation, bringing all those sources together. But when we've got it, how do we communicate it? So one of the things for us as Indigenous people, it's all about story. So my challenge is, how do I take that science and, one, communicate it in a way that my people can understand, but two, how do we take these stories so that we can, and we have a concept called wake up the snake. How do you wake up the consciousness of the people to bring the people with you? And I find stories, particularly film and poetry and plays, a very, very powerful way to tell the story of science. So multiple strategies, working with multiple people, even though we don't have a lot of resources in terms of dollars, we have a huge global and national network. And that allows us to do the work we do and put it out there, even to the point that when I published an article, I was the first person in the world to write the abstract in my language. What we have done is been more brave, and the Matawa Fitzroy River is now a legal author globally. So when you search for River of Life, Matawa, that is out there. So how do we challenge the system? How do we come along with creativity? How do we bring our fellow people with us, not just Indigenous, but non-Indigenous people? So this is, as I said, about collective wisdom. And the challenge is stop othering us. Stop othering us. Look at what we have. And the work that I'm writing about now is saying, and really challenging the world and our nation, that without Indigenous ancient wisdom and knowledge, because this comes from antiquity, we will not be able to right-size our nation nor the planet. So there's a real imperative here, and I'll finish with a piece that, someone says to me, my work, particularly my PhD, is around multi-species justice, because it's not just about our well-being, it's the well-being of those things that are around us. Now, Extinction Rebellion people say that, if the humans are so stupid and we befall our own demise, Mother Earth will right-size herself and will move forward. And I say, yes, she will. She has the capacity to do that, but she will be lonely without the vibration of human beings. We have to dance. We have to connect to country. It's about energy systems and exchange of that. So, yeah, from that, what we're saying is that stop othering this Indigenous knowledge, this Indigenous wisdom, this Indigenous science, and get to know about it, because one, everything is place-based and we want you to feel country and know country, but we can only do this together. And it is about custodial stewardship of all of us. It is about communityism, all of us working together to hold the lands and waters and look at dreaming the new economies and just development a different way.
And I mean, that is just a beautiful way to think of things. And I think that's the significance of being Indigenous and being Pacific Islander, is that it's not just evidence, it's stories, and it's that connection that's so important. Francis, in relation to your work in health and medicine, I was wondering how you're finding, I guess, people who, being from the Torres Strait, we get taught traditional medicine and traditional ways of looking at illness. Given that you're on the mainland of Australia and you're working in a Western institution, what challenges are you finding? And are there any avenues that you found where people are actually wanting to get that knowledge for Indigenous science in relation to medicine and nursing?
Yeah. The times are changing, and Indigenous knowledges are being respected and brought to the forefront. And I think of the Western ways of seeing health as the absence of disease, not the absence of country, culture, connection. And with the respect of Western knowledges now emphasizing that Indigenous people have a connection to country, have a connection to knowledge systems. So it's an awful challenge, but there are recognized disparities in outcomes in health, education, and justice systems for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I wanted to say that according to the Australian Human Rights Commission, embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander holistic definitions of health and well-being in the way we deliver health services is critical to improving health outcomes. But recognising the expertise of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities in health research, policy, and program development is the key. And a lot of my work is bringing the voices of community as to how they view health, medicine, ways of being into research, which then formalizes in these Western institutions. But it's not easy. There's psychological and strong spiritual connection, and the Indigenous concept of health being linked to traditional homeland is at risk with the effects of a lot of my work is attaching it to climate change. Caring for country is intrinsically linked to the Torres Strait Island concept of individual persons, communities, and the environmental health. There is a strong spiritual connection to the local environment with refined traditions and management practices that Western paradigms, which largely view health as the absence of disease, may not fully recognise the devastating impact of the loss of connection with country. For Torres Strait Islanders, the potential of damage to crops and limited access to traditional hunting and fishing impacts, which is our connection to country and our ways of being healthy and our nutritional status for Torres Strait Islander people is being challenged due to the climate. So the hardest work is bringing the Western paradigm systems that only sees health as the absence of disease to the way we view country. The damage to the ecosystem will adversely affect the health of Torres Strait Islander people in cultural and physical health. But my work is to bring this research with the voice of Indigenous people within community and addressing climate change to minimise the impacts on health. And I tell you what, it's a complex problem that benefits from the knowledge from a wide range of people from various disciplines.
Absolutely. Flo, in relation to the work you do, can you talk about your work in PNG with the project SEPIC and what you're trying to achieve, I guess, in your space in relation to the issues that we've been talking about?
Yeah, thanks. I'm really glad you asked that question because I think what's happening along the Sepik River is really quite extraordinary. So Project Sepik, the main coordinator is Emmanuel Penny, and who's otherwise known as Manu, and then also I want to mention Duncan Gabby, who works with him as well. They responded with communities along the Sepik River to a proposal for the world's largest gold and copper mine, which will be on a tributary or near a tributary to the Sepik River. So I'm just going to put some context and just say, because a lot of people may not have heard about the Sepik River. The Sepik River is an extremely large river. It's over 1,000 kilometres, and it's a very culturally and biodiverse place. And I say culturally diverse within communities, and even communities next to each other, they speak an entirely different language, not just a dialect. And so it's quite extraordinary place in that regard. And the crocodile is a really important part of the culture of people living along there. So this mine is a problem in itself. Again, I should say that PNG's got the third largest rainforest in the world, and a lot of people don't realise that it's after the Amazon and after the Congo Basin. So that mine will destroy a huge amount of rainforest. So, but putting that aside, the proposal they want a tailings dam. And this tailings dam is going to be about 2.5 times the size of Sydney Harbour in a seismically active area called the Pacific Ring of Fire. And the other complication is that the PNG government is unable to maintain that tailings dam in perpetuity. So they've acknowledged that if that tailings dam breaks at any point, it will lead to catastrophic loss of life and also affect the environment. So Project Sepik has been working with a number of different partners, including the Centre for Environmental Law and Community Rights, who's also our partner, on a campaign called the Save the Sepik campaign. And Southpaw and EDO worked together to provide legal advice for that campaign. What is really extraordinary about it is that Project Sepik has worked with communities and gone to different communities and worked within the traditional authority structures that are there, called House Tamburens. And they have created what they have calling the Supreme Sundung Dimi Declaration. And I'd love to read one part of it, but I just wanted to say what House Tambourines are. They're spirit houses, and that's where the political and spiritual authority, the centre of the political and spiritual authority of the community and the villages. And so the leaders within that space are representing about 78,000 people along the river. So you can imagine this is quite a large-scale self-determination exercise. And so I encourage people to read and to go to the Save the Sepik website and to read the declaration. This is one of the things that they've said in the declaration. We want to remind the owners of the Freda mine, the government of Papua New Guinea, financial supporters of the mine, and individual Papua New Guineans supporting the mine that the Supreme Sundung Dimi declares that the river is the life of the Sepik, and therefore it must be protected at all costs. It is our innate role to guard the river from exploitation and destruction by outsiders. Our future is in peril from this proposed mine, and therefore we have gathered together as guardians of the river to stand firm as one. We have the ultimate support from our ancestors who live with us in many forms. We have called on all spirits to dwell with us and take up arms to protect our Sepik way of life. And the other thing that we have been working with them, so we were influenced, and Manu has been quite interested in the rights of river paradigm. But I think what we've decided to do instead is that we're looking at the customary systems and the customary understandings on the ground. And one of the things that will be done is to use local municipal laws. So there's a possibility in Papua New Guinea, because Papua New Guinea is unique compared to Australia. Customary law trumps common law. Customary law is recognised as part of the Papua New Guinea legal system, and it can be higher than common law in terms of hierarchy. So we want to exploit that, obviously. And part of that is another process which will be a much bigger self-determination exercise in relation to the governance of the river and what they want of how to protect the river. So there'll be customary law statements that will come out of the House Tambourines. And then they'll be supported by the municipal process where local level government can create bylaws in relation to conservation. So that's our first step. And then we are going to keep building and building and building, and then potentially take it to the Supreme Court to seek a protection via the recognition of customary law. Mm. The difficulty with that is that, as I've said, there's completely different language groups, and actually the customary understanding of what the river is different from group to group. And so I'm very, very careful to ensure that we're not actually reducing or affecting the richness of the culture and the diversity there. And so we're taking very small steps and just building from the ground up, rather than taking rights of nature and imposing it on the ground. So I do encourage people to look at the Save the Sepik campaign, because it is really an incredible movement that's happening along the Sepik River.
That's wonderful to hear. And for myself, I would encourage everybody to look up the Torres Strait 8 lawsuit, which is in the United Nations right now, to see the Australian government's response and to see the self-determination and the strength of Indigenous Torres Strait Islander people in trying to protect their lands, seas and islands. So just wrapping up, what do you want non-Indigenous people to understand about the rights of nature and about personhood and about ancestral connection, and also about utilising Indigenous scientific knowledge? So I might start with Anne.
Yeah, I think the first thing is everything is place-based. Mm. Everything is determined from where the source of the land and the living waters come from. So one of the things I've been trying to do is get people to connect to where they are, form that relationship with country, go and sit on the Yarra River if you're in Melbourne, or do something down at the Kooyong Lakes. What we're trying to do is get people to feel the country, because we want people to start to not feel sorry for it, but create an empathy, create their own relationship with this. Because at the end of the day, what we're talking about is custodial stewardship of everyone on the land, so that we all start to see and be in the world a different way. I go back to the conversation I started with, is that we come from a world of we, not me. So we have to shift beyond individualism and self-gratification to look at what is the greater good of all, not the greater good of the few. And when you look at invasive, unjust development, we are taught by our government in Australia that, you know, we can afford to destroy these sacred and special places because we are looking at the greater good of the few, because we have to be careful about the illusion of probity. What is the real intent of creating these laws? And as I said, what I'm trying to do in the work that, you know, we're doing up here is to really get people to start to develop that custodial stewardship, that custodial ethics, to look at where we are from a communityism perspective, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Because what I say is that the Fitzroy River or the Matawa is national heritage listed. It belongs to every Australian in this country, but more importantly, it's the largest registered Aboriginal cultural heritage site in Western Australia. So what we're saying is that we have, you know, these laws that are not fit for purpose. Part of changing that is to also work with our fellow Australians and, you know, even in Papua New Guinea, the work that's doing there. How do we bring the people with us? So I think it's having these sorts of conversations, sharing with each other, because many of us work in isolation, and it's great to have the validation that, hey, yeah, we're all thinking the same way. We're dealing with complexity. We need collective wisdom. How do we bring that in? You know, one of the questions to me was, why are you doing a second PhD? And I find the more I know, the more I do not. And so therefore we need each other. We need to network. We need to hear those stories. I think the big challenge here in Australia is moving from just interest to rights. What does a true property right mean for Indigenous people in the Torres Strait in Australia? What does that mean in modernity? We have been here guarding these assets, looking after them, caring for them from the beginning of time. And I think we really need to challenge the legal framework to look at what does property right, because right now our rights and interests are being pushed aside for unjust, invasive development. And we are at the front line of these projects. And what we're saying is that we need a different way to share our stories, to show that what we're trying to do is for the greater benefit of all of us in this country, and not just a few little what I call greedy frogs that might want to come up here and suck up all the water from the Fitzroy River. So it's about having a time where we go, okay, how do we do this differently? It can't be business as usual. We have real opportunities of creating culture conservation, restoration projects that can bring in wealth creation. We need to shift from the story of seeing gas and, you know, fossil fuel as the energy transition. And how do we do it differently? But we care about those people working there. We have great opportunities in this nation to build the new economies, and we must do this together.
Absolutely. And the idea of caring for nature, Francis, I wanted to follow up with you that what do you want non-Indigenous people to understand about the idea of caring for nature, which translates to caring for your own health, your own well-being, and the importance of utilizing Indigenous scientific knowledge?
Yeah, and I would like to start with, you know, Torres Strait could be in a position in the near future of being displaced, and within our country to have First Nations people displaced from their homeland is unbearable. How are they facing this in today's times? And I want to put non-Indigenous people, wherever they live, to understand, if I was to come up to you and say, you no longer can live here, we're going to move you, and have that emotional attachment to, if it was put upon you, what are you going to do? And have an emotional tie to what these people are facing. You know, we so loosely talk about the canary in the mind, and what changes will we do when the canary starts changing the way it lives, or, you know, if it starts embarking on ill health. We then react. Well, the problem we are facing, the canary's dead. But we're so profit-driven as a state or a nation that it's irrelevant what these people are facing. And I think we need to make an emotional tie to, if it was upon us, what would we do, or what would we want, and relate that to your health. So we're all interconnected in some format, but it's having that connectivity to bringing it back to you. And if it was upon you, what would you want? And First Nations people are tired of swimming the river. They're swimming upstream to the policies that have been created, that when we're downstream, we're only receiving. We want input into those policies. To make change and to have a different future is having a voice within those policies as we create them. We don't want to swim the river. We don't want to pull people out of the river. We want to get to the top. So
that's it.
People need to understand.
You know, we want a seat at the table and we want to have our voice heard. That's what it is. So Flo, just in wrapping up, what do you want non-Indigenous people to understand about the area that you're working in, you know, in international law, but also just with the different populations that you work with that are obviously Indigenous people aren't a homogenous group. So what do you want non-Indigenous people to realize and to understand and to take away from today's session?
I might narrow my subset of who I'm talking to, if you don't mind, and say what I want environmental lawyers to do, because our role is to provide the infrastructure and support and dealing with and addressing colonial law and trying to mitigate against its damages. And so I think I'm going to talk about them first, but I want to just reiterate first what Anne said, that to be a good environmental lawyer, or what I call a decolonial environmental lawyer, is that you have to have nuance and you have to understand place. Anne spoke about how the Australian laws are not fit for purpose, but unfortunately, a lot of Australian environmental lawyers, and I think probably the same as New Zealand environmental lawyers, they ended up exporting Australian environmental laws to the Pacific when it doesn't work. Like, we know it doesn't work, and yet now Pacific Islands are having to grapple with laws that actually don't work. So that's one thing. I think there needs to be a greater imagination of what environmental lawyers do and what is environmental law. And so one of the innovations of our program at EDO, and which has been pushed by 3 Pacific lawyers, is that we're now working with customary law. And customary law is environmental law. It is environmental law. And so that's the expansion that we want, and an understanding that you've got to be really careful when you're working at the state level that you're not squashing customary law. So a really good example is by Jackie Evans talks about the Cook Islands, where they use rahui, and rahui is taboo. It's a prohibition, and it comes from traditional authority, and the state wanted to be the one who declares rahui. And what that actually does, it undermines traditional authority, but it also undermines the sacredness and the mana, the prestige and authority of that particular taboo, and how it works. So you've got to be really careful as an environmental lawyer that you're not doing those kind of things where you're undermining the people that you're actually wanting to assist. The other thing, which I completely agree with, and I think it's really important, is providing pathways for First Nations and Pacific lawyers, not only into your organisation, but into leadership roles. And I'm with Anne in the sense that I agree that we all have to be in it together, but in it together under Indigenous leadership if you're working with First Nations or if you're working with Pacific people. Because we've just got a lot to offer in terms of the way that we think about. We already have an analysis of colonisation. We've been through it. People are still going through it. So I just think that we've got a lot to offer in that sense. And so organisations have to open the space and, sharp elbows. We need to get in there and start leading.
Well, thank you so much for meeting today and helping me have this conversation. I mean, everything you've said really points to Indigenous people are empowering themselves, and if that power is taken away, we're going around that obstacle and then doing it again and then pushing for a seat at the table, having our voice heard, having that visibility. And I think that's really what it's all about. The 3 of you working in different spaces but really trying to achieve the same goals, which is basic human rights for Indigenous people. It's really that fundamental, and that it's such an easy concept to understand, but such a hard ideology to implement and to be accepted in Western countries. So, well, on that note, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I do wish to thank Anne Paulina, Francis Noah, and Fleur Ramsey for your input today, and thank you all for joining us.